In the gleaming towers of Neo-Tokyo's corporate district, a mid-level data analyst was about to defy the most powerful surveillance system ever created. What started as a routine notification took a shocking turn when Takashi Han came face with an algorithmic mandate that would change everything. Takashi Han wasn't your typical corporate employee for 5 years. He had spent his life navigating Nexus Corporation's invasive monitoring systems, known for his principled resistance to algorithmic control, when the Destiny Protocol selected him as the optimal romantic partner for CEO Victoria Sterling. He made a choice that would shatter the illusion of corporate perfection and awaken something unexpected in the Ice Queen herself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. If the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The notification arrived at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, sliding across Takashi Han's holographic display with the gentle chime that had become synonymous with corporate announcements. Around him, the 42nd floor of Nexus Corporation hummed with its usual symphony of productivity, the soft whisper of climate control, the muted clicking of haptic keyboards, and the occasional murmur of colleagues discussing quarterly projections and voices carefully modulated to avoid triggering the ambient audio sensors. Takashi's fingers paused above his keyboard as the message expanded, its corporate blue gradient framing words that seemed to shimmer with algorithmic certainty. Destiny Protocol Match Notification Priority Alpha. His throat tightened. Familiar knot of anxiety that had become his body's default response to anything bearing the company's official seal. The Destiny Protocol. Even the name made his skin crawl, though he'd grown accustomed to the invasive technologies that Nexus Corporation insisted were lifestyle enhancements rather than surveillance systems. Every employee wore a biometric monitor disguised as a sleek wristband, tracking everything from heart rate variability to stress hormones. Microcameras embedded in workstations recorded facial expressions and eye movements. The company's AI systems analyzed speech patterns, social interactions, even the way employees walked through the corridors, all in service of what Dr. Richard Blackwood, the Chief Technology Officer, called optimal human resource allocation. But this was different. This was personal. Congratulations, Mr. Han. The message continued in that eerily cheerful tone that corporate algorithms had perfected. Based on comprehensive psychological profiling, biometric compatibility assessment, and productivity optimization protocols, you have been selected as the optimal romantic partner for Victoria Sterling, Chief Executive Officer. Please report to Human Resources Division, Level 60, at your earliest convenience to discuss integration protocols. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Victoria Sterling, the Ice Queen herself, as employees whispered when they thought the monitoring systems couldn't parse context from tone. The woman who had transformed Nexus Corporation from her father's modest tech startup into a surveillance empire that employed half of Neo-Tokyo. Takashi had seen her exactly 3 times in his 5 years at the company, once during the annual shareholders presentation, once in the elevator where she'd stared through him as if he were transparent, and once in the corporate cafeteria where she'd dismissed a department head with the casual cruelty of someone swatting an insect. The memory of his sister's funeral flashed unbidden through his mind. Yuki, 22 years old, brilliant and full of dreams, had died in what Nexus Corporation's press releases called an unfortunate industrial accident. The truth that she'd been working on a whistleblower report about the company's illegal surveillance programs when she'd suffered a sudden and fatal allergic reaction to a meal that somehow contained shellfish. Despite her severe allergy being documented in her medical files, had died with her. The corporate investigation had been swift, thorough, and utterly hollow. Case closed. Move along. Nothing to see here. Staring at that screen any harder and you might develop laser vision, Marcus Thompson's voice cut through his reverie. His best friend and cubicle neighbor leaned against the partition, his usually playful expression tempered with concern. Marcus was one of the few people at Nexus who understood Takashi's deep-seated distrust of the company. Having witnessed his own idealistic dreams slowly corrode in the face of corporate reality, "They want me to date Victoria Sterling," Takashi said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Even so, he knew the ambient sensors were capturing every syllable, analyzing his tone for signs of emotional distress or worse, potential insubordination. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. The Ice Queen? Damn, Tack. He paused, seeming to search for words that wouldn't trigger algorithmic flags. That's unexpected. It's a violation, Takashi corrected, his fingers clenching involuntarily. They're treating human relationships like software optimization, like we're just variables in some equation. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the eastern wall, Neo-Tokyo sprawled beneath them in a maze of neon and chrome. Hovercars traced glowing paths between towers that scraped the perpetually smoggy sky, while digital billboards painted the cityscape in rotating hues of corporate messaging. Somewhere in that urban labyrinth were millions of people living their lives, making their own choices about love and connection and intimacy. But here, in the sterile heart of Nexus Corporation, even the most fundamental human experiences were subject to algorithmic oversight. You could always comply, Marcus suggested, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Sterling's attractive, brilliant, powerful. There are worse fates than being matched with the CEO. Takashi's laugh was bitter. Is that what you'd call my sister's fate? A worse fate? The words hung between them like a challenge. Marcus's expression sobered, and he glanced around nervously before leaning closer. That's dangerous thinking, Tack. You know they monitor for patterns of dissent? Let them monitor. The words came out with more vehemence than Takashi had intended, and he forced himself to lower his voice. I won't be their puppet. I won't pretend to feel something I don't, just because their algorithm says it's optimal. The holographic display pulsed gently, reminding him that human resources was still waiting for his response. Around them, the office continued its relentless rhythm of productivity. Colleagues bent over their workstations, fingers dancing across keyboards, eyes locked on screens filled with data streams that would be processed, analyzed and monetized by systems they barely understood. The biometric bands on their wrists glowed softly, transmitting their biological signatures. 2 central servers that tracked everything from their caffeine intake to their sleep cycles. This was the world Nexus Corporation had built, one where privacy was obsolete, where personal choice was filtered through algorithmic recommendations, where even love itself was subject to corporate optimization. Takashi, despite his modest position as a mid-level data analyst, was about to reject it all. The system will flag this as insubordination, Marcus warned, his voice tight with worry. They'll come down hard on you. Transfer, demotion, maybe worse, maybe. Takashi's fingers moved to the response interface, hovering over the acceptance button that pulsed with inviting green light. It would be so easy. One touch, and he could slip back into the comfortable anonymity of corporate compliance. His life would continue its predictable trajectory data analysis by day. Solitary evenings in his company-subsidized apartment. Weekend visits to his parents who still believed their son worked for a respectable technology firm rather than a surveillance empire. But Yuki's face appeared in his mind again, laughing as she showed him her latest research project. Her eyes bright with the conviction that technology could make the world better rather than more controlled. She died for refusing to accept the unacceptable. The least he could do was honor her memory by making the same choice. His finger moved to the rejection button, a small red indicator at the bottom of the interface. The system required confirmation for negative responses. 3 separate acknowledgments that he understood the consequences of his choice. With each click, Takashi felt something shifting inside him, a sense of liberation that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Refusal submitted, the system announced with mechanical indifference. Your response has been forwarded to appropriate supervisory personnel. Marcus stared at him in stunned silence. Around them, the office hummed on, oblivious to the small act of rebellion that had just taken place. But Takashi knew that somewhere in the building's upper floors, Victoria Sterling was about to learn that her perfect algorithmic world contained at least one anomaly, one person who valued authenticity over advancement, principle over profit. The notification disappeared from his screen, replaced by his usual data streams and productivity metrics. But everything had changed. For the first time in 5 years, Takashi Han had chosen his own path. The consequences would follow soon enough. But for now, he savored the strange lightness that came with refusing to be optimized. His wristband pulsed softly, recording the slight elevation in his heart rate, the barely perceptible changes in his stress hormones. Somewhere in Nexus Corporation's vast server farms, algorithms were already processing his rebellion, categorizing it, analyzing it, preparing responses to neutralize this unexpected variable in their perfect system. But for this moment at least, Takashi belonged to himself. The rejection alert materialized on Victoria Sterling's executive display at 3:12 p.m. Its red warning indicator cutting through the steady stream of quarterly reports and board meeting preparations like a digital knife. She stared at the anomalous message for a full 30 seconds. Her perfectly manicured fingers frozen above the haptic interface. Before the impossibility of what she was seeing truly registered, no one had ever refused the Destiny Protocol. Not once, in the 3 years since Dr. Blackwood had implemented the system across all Nexus Corporation divisions. The algorithm was flawless, so she'd been assured. It analyzed psychological compatibility with the precision of a Swiss chronometer, factoring in everything from pheromone production to conversational patterns to long-term relationship potential. When the system made a match, it was with 97.3% accuracy. And yet, Takashi Han, a name she vaguely recognized from departmental reports but had never given conscious thought, had simply declined. Lena Victoria called softly, her voice carrying the particular tone that her personal assistant had learned to interpret as controlled confusion, masquerading as executive calm. Elena Rodriguez appeared in the doorway almost instantly, her tablet already synchronized to Victoria's. Systems, brown eyes alert behind wire-rimmed glasses that somehow managed to look both professional and warm. In the 5 years since Elena had taken the position, she'd become more than just an assistant. She was Victoria's translator for the human world that existed beyond algorithmic parameters and quarterly projections. Yes, Ms. Sterling. Pull up employee file 7742 Delta 9, Victoria said, her gaze never leaving the rejection notice. Complete psychological profile, performance metrics, personal history, everything. Elena's fingers danced across her tablet with practiced efficiency. Takashi Han, Data Analysis Division, Level 42. Hired 5 years ago. Consistently high performance ratings. No disciplinary actions. Master's degree in statistics from Tokyo University. Specialization in pattern recognition and... She paused, her eyebrows rising slightly. Interesting. His sister was Yuki Han. She died 3 years ago in what was classified as an industrial accident, but the file indicates she was working on a research project related to privacy protection algorithms. At the time, Victoria's attention sharpened. Corporate accidents were carefully managed events, or investigations conducted with surgical precision to minimize liability and public scrutiny. She'd signed off on the Yuki Han settlement herself, though at the time it had been just another line item in the quarterly legal expenditures. Now, the connection felt suddenly significant. Psychological profile? Victoria asked. High intelligence quotient, strong moral framework, tendency toward introversion, but with deep loyalty to close relationships.
Oh.
The analysis indicates significant distrust of authority structures, particularly following his sister's death, categorized as low compliance risk due to his non-confrontational nature, but Elena hesitated, scrolling through additional data. There's a note here about potential for principled resistance if core values are threatened. Victoria leaned back in her chair, the soft leather creaking almost imperceptibly. Her corner office occupied the entire northwest section of the 80th floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Neo-Tokyo's sprawling metropolis. But for the first time in months, the city's ordered chaos failed to provide its usual sense of control and mastery. He refused me, she said quietly, the words feeling strange on her tongue. In her 31 years of existence, rejection had been an abstract concept, something that happened to other people, lesser people who lacked her combination of intellect, beauty, and power. Even her romantic relationships, such as they were, had been carefully orchestrated affairs. Partnerships that served mutual professional interests while satisfying the basic human need for companionship. But this was different. This was personal. Even though she'd never met the man, perhaps there was a system error, Elena suggested diplomatically. The Destiny Protocol has never... The system doesn't make errors. The voice came from the office entrance, where Dr. Richard Blackwood stood framed in the doorway like a figure from a corporate nightmare. Tall and lean, with prematurely silver hair and eyes the color of winter sky, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had reduced human behavior to mathematical equations and found them elegantly simple. Victoria gestured for him to enter, noting how Elena's posture subtly stiffened in his presence. Her assistant had never expressed her opinion of the CTO directly, but Victoria had learned to read the subtle signs of her discomfort around him. "Richard, I wasn't expecting you." "The system flagged the anomaly immediately," Blackwood said, settling into one of the chairs facing her desk with practiced ease. "This Han individual represents a significant threat to the integrity of the Destiny Protocol. If word spreads that employees can simply refuse algorithmic matches, it could undermine years of psychological conditioning." Victoria found herself bristling at his casual dismissal. "Psychological conditioning?" "Employee optimization," Blackwood corrected smoothly. "The Destiny Protocol isn't just about romantic compatibility. It's about creating stable, predictable relationship patterns that enhance productivity and reduce workplace stress. When employees know their personal lives are being managed by superior intelligence, they can focus entirely on their professional responsibilities." Elena cleared her throat delicately. "If I may, Dr. Blackwood, the psychological literature suggests that forced romantic pairings often produce the opposite effect. Increased stress, resentment, and decreased performance." Blackwood's smile was patronizing. "Outdated research, I'm afraid. Traditional psychology fails to account for the precision of modern algorithmic analysis. We can predict compatibility with greater accuracy than the subjects themselves." "Apparently not," Victoria said dryly, gesturing toward the rejection notice still glowing on her screen. "Mr. Han seems to have found our precision inadequate." For just a moment, Blackwood's composure flickered. An anomaly. Perhaps psychological damage from his sister's death has created irrational resistance patterns. "I recommend immediate corrective action transferred to a less desirable position, reduction in compensation, social isolation protocols, standard techniques for managing noncompliance." The casual cruelty in his voice sparked something unexpected in Victoria's chest, a flutter of what might have been protective instinct. The sensation was so foreign that she almost dismissed it as indigestion from her lunch meeting with the board of directors. "No," she said quietly. Both Elena and Blackwood stared at her. "No," Blackwood repeated. "I want to understand him first. This Takashi Han. What makes someone refuse what the algorithm deems optimal?" Victoria found herself genuinely curious. For the first time in months, her mind already beginning to analyze the puzzle he represented. "Schedule a departmental review of Level 42. Something routine, non-threatening. I want to observe him directly." Blackwood's expression darkened. "Victoria, I strongly advise against personal involvement. The system works precisely because it removes emotional variables from the equation. If you begin second-guessing algorithmic decisions based on sentiment, I'm not second-guessing anything." Victoria interrupted, her voice carrying the steel that had helped her transform Nexus Corporation into an empire. "I'm conducting due diligence on a potential system vulnerability. If the Destiny Protocol can be refused without consequence, then we need to understand how and why." Elena made a note on her tablet, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes bright with what Victoria suspected might be approval. "I'll arrange the departmental review for tomorrow afternoon. Should I include Mr. Han specifically in the itinerary? Make it seem natural. Routine performance evaluations, productivity metrics review, standard corporate theater." Victoria turned back to Blackwood, whose jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. "In the meantime, I want his complete surveillance file. Everything biometric data, social interaction patterns, private communications if we have access. That level of monitoring requires... I'm the CEO, Richard. I don't require authorization to review employee data." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, surprising them all. Victoria rarely felt the need to assert her authority so directly. Usually her position spoke for itself. Blackwood inclined his head in acknowledgement, but his eyes remained cold. Of course, I'll have the files transferred within the hour. But Victoria, I urge caution. This individual has already demonstrated unpredictable behavior. Too close to an unstable variable could have unintended consequences. After he left, Alina remained standing by Victoria's desk, her expression thoughtful. Miss Sterling, if I may ask why, are you so interested in this particular employee? The company has thousands of workers. Surely one rejection isn't worth this level of attention? Victoria considered the question, gazing out at the city below where millions of people made their own choices about love and connection and intimacy. For her entire adult life, every decision had been filtered through corporate strategy. Every relationship analyzed for potential advantage. Even her romantic encounters had been carefully orchestrated affairs, partnerships that served mutual professional interests while satisfying basic biological needs. But Takashi Han had looked at what the algorithm offered, what she offered by extension, and found it wanting. The rejection stung in ways she hadn't expected, awakening something that felt almost like vulnerability. Because she said, "Finally, I've never met anyone who thought I wasn't worth having." The words hung in the air between them, revealing more than Victoria had intended. Elena's expression softened with something that looked almost like sympathy, and for a moment, Victoria felt the full weight of her isolation pressing down like the corporate structure that had shaped her entire existence. Tomorrow, she would meet the man who had done the impossible. And perhaps finally she would understand what it meant to be genuinely surprised by another human being. The city lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, each one representing a life lived beyond algorithmic oversight. Victoria watched them pulse and shimmer, and found herself wondering for the first time in years what it might feel like to be truly unpredictably human. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The elevator's gentle hum filled the silence as Victoria descended toward level 42, her reflection multiplying infinitely in the polished steel walls. She'd spent the morning reviewing Takashi Han's surveillance files, 3 years of biometric data, workplace interactions, and behavioral patterns that painted the portrait of a man who existed quietly within Nexus Corporation's systems while maintaining an emotional distance from them. Now, at 2:30 p.m. on Wednesday, she was about to meet the anomaly face-to-face. Alina walked beside her, tablet in hand, maintaining the professional demeanor that made these routine departmental reviews believable. But Victoria caught the subtle glances. The way her assistant's eyes searched her face for signs of the curiosity that had kept Victoria awake until nearly 3 a.m. Studying footage of a man who ate lunch alone, worked with methodical precision, and somehow managed to smile genuinely at his friend Marcus while maintaining careful distance from everyone else. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the organized chaos of the data analysis division. Unlike the pristine executive floors, level 42 hummed with the energy of actual work, the soft murmur of conversations, the rhythmic clicking of keyboards, the occasional burst of laughter that the ambient sensors dutifully recorded and analyzed. Victoria had forgotten what productive noise sounded like. Miss Sterling. Department Manager Janet Morrison appeared instantly, her face flushed with the particular panic that came with unexpected executive visits. "We weren't expecting, that is, I wasn't informed. Routine review, Janet. Nothing to worry about." Victoria's voice carried the practiced calm that had been drilled into her since childhood. "I want to observe normal operations, speak with a few team members about their current projects." She let her gaze sweep across the floor, noting how conversations had gradually died as employees became aware of her presence. But there, in the third row of workstations, a figure remained hunched over his display, fingers moving steadily across a holographic interface as if the CEO's arrival was merely background noise. Takashi Han. Even from a distance, Victoria could See the quality that had intrigued her in the surveillance footage, a sense of complete absorption in his work that suggested genuine engagement rather than performative busyness. His dark hair fell slightly across his forehead as he leaned forward, and she noticed the way his shoulders remained relaxed, despite the tension that had settled over the rest of the floor. Perhaps we could start with the quarterly productivity metrics, Alina suggested diplomatically, but Victoria was already moving toward the third row. Actually, I'd like to speak with Mr. Han about his current analysis project. The words carried across the suddenly quiet floor, and Victoria watched as Takashi's fingers finally stilled. He turned in his chair slowly, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly angular features that suggested both intelligence and stubbornness. Dark eyes that met hers without the automatic deference she'd grown accustomed to seeing. When he stood, his movement was economical, controlled, like someone who had learned not to draw unnecessary attention to himself. Miss Sterling. Voice was quieter than she'd expected, but there was no tremor in it, no sign of the anxiety that typically accompanied her presence. How can I help you? Up close. He was taller than the surveillance footage had suggested, probably just under 6 feet, with the lean build of someone who worked long hours, but maintained basic physical fitness. His clothes were standard corporate casual dark slacks, white shirt, ubiquitous biometric wristband, but something in the way he wore them suggested he'd chosen them for function rather than impression. I understand you're working on pattern recognition in the financial services data stream, Victoria said, acutely aware that every word was being recorded by multiple systems. Around them, she could feel the rest of the department pretending to work while straining to overhear. I'd be interested in your preliminary findings. Takashi's expression didn't change, but she caught something flickering in his eyes. Surprise. Perhaps that she knew the specifics of his assignment. The patterns are interesting. Traditional fraud detection algorithms focus on transaction anomalies, but I've been analyzing behavioral consistency instead. Why people develop habits around money that are almost as unique as fingerprints. And you can identify fraudulent activity by detecting deviations from these behavioral baselines? Sometimes, though the more interesting discovery is how often legitimate users are flagged as fraudulent, simply because they've made decisions that don't align with algorithmic expectations. He paused, and Victoria caught the subtle emphasis he placed on the last phrase. It seems people don't always behave the way systems predict they should. The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that had nothing to do with financial data. Victoria found herself genuinely intrigued not just by his work, but by the careful way he'd managed to reference their situation, without saying anything that could be construed as insubordination. Fascinating. And how do you propose we distinguish between legitimate behavioral variation and actual fraud? Human oversight. The answer came without hesitation. Algorithms can identify anomalies, but they can't understand context. That requires judgment, empathy, the ability to recognize that sometimes people act against their own apparent interests for reasons that are entirely valid. Marcus Thompson appeared at Takashi's shoulder, his usual cheerful demeanor slightly strained. Miss Sterling, what an honor. Takashi's been working on this project for months, really groundbreaking stuff. Victoria noted the protective instinct in Marcus's positioning. The way he'd inserted himself into the conversation as if to shield his friend from potential corporate retaliation. The loyalty was admirable, if unnecessary. She had no intention of punishing Takashi for his intellectual honesty. I'm sure it is. Mr. Han, would you be available for a brief one-on-one discussion? Perhaps we could continue this conversation over coffee in the executive dining room. Casual, friendly even, but Victoria watched as something shifted in Takashi's expression. The careful neutrality remained, but underneath it, she sensed a wariness that hadn't been there before. I appreciate the offer, Miss Sterling, but I have a deadline to meet on the fraud analysis. Perhaps we could schedule something for next week. The polite deflection hit Victoria like a physical blow. Around them, she could feel the shock rippling through the department. Employees didn't decline casual invitations from the CEO. Such things simply didn't happen in the carefully ordered world of Nexus Corporation. But Takashi had just done. Exactly that, with the same quiet conviction that had led him to refuse the Destiny Protocol. Of course, Victoria managed, her voice remaining steady, despite the strange mixture of admiration and frustration coursing through her. Your work is clearly a priority. Perhaps Alina can coordinate with your schedule. She was already turning to leave when Takashi spoke again. Ms. Sterling? Victoria paused, looking back at him expectantly. For what it's worth, I think the financial services project would benefit from your perspective. You understand both the algorithmic and human sides of decision-making better than most. If you'd like to review my findings, I'd be happy to send you a summary. The offer was professional, appropriate, and completely unexpected. Victoria found herself studying his face, searching for any sign of mockery or manipulation, but found only the same quiet sincerity that had characterized their entire interaction. I'd like that very much, she said finally. As the elevator doors closed behind her 10 minutes later, Victoria realized that her hands were slightly unsteady. In 31 years of existence, she'd never had a conversation that felt so much like intellectual combat disguised as professional courtesy. Takashi Hun had managed to reject her twice in the span of 24 hours. It somehow left her wanting more of his attention rather than less. Interesting man, Alina observed carefully as they rose toward the executive floors. Yes, Victoria agreed, watching the floor numbers climb. He is. But what truly unsettled her was the growing suspicion that Takashi Han understood something about authentic human connection that she'd never learned, and that all her corporate power and algorithmic precision couldn't force him to teach her. The city sprawled beneath them as they ascended, millions of lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Each one represented a choice, a life lived according to personal desires rather than systematic optimization. And for the first time, in her carefully orchestrated existence, Victoria Sterling found herself wondering what it would feel like to be just another light in that vast, chaotic, beautifully unpredictable constellation. Tomorrow, she would read his analysis. And perhaps, in his insights about behavioral patterns and algorithmic limitations, she might discover something about the woman she could become if she stopped trying to be the perfect executive the system had designed her to be. Takashi's report arrived in Victoria's personal inbox at 7:23 a.m. the following morning. Its arrival notification cutting through her usual routine of reviewing overnight market reports and regulatory briefings. She found herself abandoning the quarterly projections she'd been analyzing, drawn instead to the modest file labeled Behavioral Pattern Analysis, Financial Services Division. What she discovered was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Takashi had identified 17 distinct behavioral signatures in financial transactions. Patterns so subtle that traditional fraud detection algorithms missed them entirely. But more than that, it documented case after case where the system's rigid parameters had flagged legitimate users as fraudulent, simply because their financial decisions didn't conform to statistical norms. People who donate large sums to charity are flagged as potential money launderers, she read aloud to Alina, who sat across from her desk reviewing the day's schedule. Individuals who make cash purchases above certain thresholds are automatically investigated. Regardless of their documented income sources, the system penalizes financial behavior that deviates from algorithmic expectations, even when that behavior is completely legal and ethical. Alina looked up from her tablet, her expression thoughtful. It sounds like he's describing more than just fraud detection. Victoria paused, recognizing the parallel Alina was drawing. The Destiny Protocol operated on similar principles in leanalizing human behavior and flagging deviations from predicted patterns. When someone like Takashi refused an algorithmic match, the system interpreted it as an error requiring correction rather than a valid expression of personal choice. Schedule A. Follow-up meeting, Victoria said impulsively. I want to discuss his findings in detail. He's already declined one meeting, Ms. Sterling. Perhaps a more indirect approach would be more effective. Victoria found herself studying Elena's carefully neutral expression, recognizing the diplomatic way her assistant was suggesting that direct pursuit might be counterproductive. It was advice she'd never needed before in her world. Meetings happened because she requested them, not because the other party was willing to participate. What kind of indirect approach? His personnel file indicates he typically eats lunch at 12:30, usually alone in the level 42 break room. If you happen to be reviewing operations in that area, suggestion was perfectly reasonable. It's the kind of strategic positioning that Victoria had been trained to execute since childhood. Yet something about it felt wrong, almost predatory. She was considering this when her personal communication system chimed with an incoming priority message from Dr. Blackwood. "We need to discuss the Han situation immediately," the message read. "My office, 9 a.m. Victoria glanced at her chronometer, 8:47 a.m. Blackwood's urgency was unusual and concerning. She'd known him for 8 years, since her father had recruited him from MIT, and he rarely displayed such direct impatience. 20 minutes later, she sat in Blackwood's sterile office, surrounded by wall-mounted displays showing real-time data streams from across Nexus Corporation's surveillance network. The CTO stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him as he watched employee productivity metrics scroll past in endless columns of green and amber indicators. "The Han anomaly is spreading," he said without preamble. Yesterday's departmental review has triggered curiosity among his colleagues. We're detecting increased private conversations, elevated stress indicators, and a 12% decrease in Destiny Protocol compliance rates among Level 42 employees. Victoria felt a flutter of something that might have been pride. He's influencing others. He's contaminating them. Blackwood turned to face her, his pale eyes sharp with irritation. The Destiny Protocol works because employees believe it's infallible. When someone publicly refuses a match and suffers no consequences, it undermines the system's psychological authority. Perhaps the system's authority shouldn't be based on fear of consequences. The words came out before Victoria could stop them, surprising them both. Blackwood's expression shifted from irritation to something approaching alarm. "Victoria, I hope you're not allowing personal curiosity to cloud your judgment. The Han individual is a threat to everything we've built here. His sister was a similar disruption, questioning corporate policies, encouraging resistance among her colleagues. We managed that situation, but only after significant damage to operational efficiency." The casual way he referenced Yuki Han's death sent a chill through Victoria's chest. "Managed, contained," Blackwood corrected smoothly. "The point is, we cannot allow lightning to strike twice. I recommend immediate action. Transfer Han to a remote facility. Reduce his access to sensitive systems. Implement social isolation. Protocols. Standard procedures for managing psychological contamination." Victoria found herself thinking of Takashi's report, his insights about algorithmic limitations and the value of human judgment. "What if we're wrong, Richard? What if the system isn't as perfect as we believe?" Blackwood's laugh was cold. "Perfection is relative, Victoria. Our algorithms predict human behavior with 97% accuracy. Traditional human intuition operates at barely 60%. Even if we're occasionally wrong, we're still far superior to the chaos of unmanaged human choice." But Takashi's analysis suggests Takashi Han is not a systems architect or a behavioral psychologist. He's a mid-level data analyst whose personal trauma has created irrational resistance to authority structures. His insights are the product of emotional damage, not objective analysis. The dismissal stung more than Victoria had expected. She found herself remembering the careful way Takashi had chosen his words, the thoughtful intelligence behind his observations. There had been nothing irrational about his behavior, quite the opposite. "I want more time to evaluate the situation," she said finally. "Time we don't have. Every day Han remains in place. His influence spreads. I strongly recommend immediate action. And I strongly recommend patience. One employee questioning our systems isn't going to bring down Nexus Corporation." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Very well. But when this situation escalates, and it will remember that I warned you." After leaving his office, Victoria found herself taking an unplanned detour to Level 42. She told herself it was routine executive oversight, but she knew it was something else entirely. Through the transparent walls of the break room, she could see Takashi sitting alone at a small table, reading something on a tablet, while eating what appeared to be a homemade lunch. Without fully deciding to do so, She entered the break room. "Mr. Hahn, I hope I'm not disturbing your lunch." He looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness. "Miss Sterling?" "Not at all." He started to stand, but she gestured for him to remain seated. "I read your report. Fascinating work. Your insights about behavioral baselines could revolutionize how we approach fraud detection." "Thank you. I suspect the real revolution would be recognizing that not all anomalies are problems to be solved." Again, the carefully chosen words that carry deeper meaning. Victoria found herself taking the seat across from him acutely, aware that their conversation was being recorded by multiple surveillance systems. "Sometimes anomalies are innovations waiting to be understood," she agreed. For a moment, something shifted in Takashi's expression, a flicker of surprise that she'd engaged with his implicit meaning. "In my experience, most systems prefer predictability. Over innovation, change is disruptive. Perhaps some systems need disruption." Words hung between them, loaded with implications that had nothing to do with fraud detection algorithms. Victoria watched as Takashi studied her face, clearly trying to determine whether she was genuinely engaging with his ideas or setting some kind of trap. "Change is risky," he said finally. "It requires accepting that current methods might be flawed, that people might know things about themselves that algorithms can't predict, and that scares most executives." "Does it scare you?" The question was direct, personal, completely inappropriate for a casual lunch conversation between CEO and employee. Victoria found herself considering it seriously anyway. "I'm beginning to think it should," she admitted. Something in her tone must have convinced him of her sincerity, because his posture relaxed slightly. "The scariest part isn't admitting that systems can be wrong. It's accepting that sometimes the things we think protect us are actually limiting us." Their eyes met across the small table, and for just a moment, Victoria felt as if she were seeing herself through his perspectiva. Woman so thoroughly programmed by corporate strategy that she'd forgotten what it felt like to make an authentic choice. "I should let you finish your lunch," she said, suddenly aware that they'd been talking for nearly 20 minutes. "Ms. Sterling?" Takashi's voice stopped her as she reached the doorway. "Thank you for reading the report, and for listening." Walking back to the executive elevators, Victoria realized that her hands were trembling slightly. In the space of a single conversation, Takashi Hahn had managed to do something that years of board meetings and strategic sessions had failed. To accomplish, he'd made her question whether the life she'd built was actually the life she wanted. That evening, alone in her penthouse apartment, overlooking Neo-Tokyo's glittering skyline, Victoria found herself thinking about anomalies and innovations, about the difference between being protected and being imprisoned. Somewhere in the city. Below, Takashi was probably having dinner with his family or reading a book or doing any of the thousand ordinary things that people did when they weren't being optimized by algorithmic systems. And for the first time in her carefully orchestrated existence, Victoria Sterling envied him that freedom. The crisis began at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday, when Nexus Corporation's primary financial networks detected an intrusion that bypassed 17 layers of security protocols. Victoria's emergency alert pierced through her restless sleep, dragging her from dreams of surveillance cameras and algorithmic choices into the harsh reality of corporate catastrophe. By the time she arrived at headquarters 43 minutes later, the situation had escalated beyond standard breach protocols. The attack wasn't random, it was surgical, precise, targeting specific vulnerability points that suggested intimate knowledge of Nexus systems. Worse, the intruder had left behind a message embedded in the core financial databases. Some patterns can't be predicted. Dr. Blackwood met her in the elevator, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from the late-night emergency response. "We've contained the immediate damage, but the implications are severe. Whoever did this understands our architecture better than most of our own engineers." "Internal threat?" Victoria asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Almost certainly. The attack vectors suggest someone with level 7 access or higher. Combined with advanced knowledge of our algorithmic frameworks," Blackwood's pale eyes glittered with something that might have been satisfaction. "I've already initiated a comprehensive audit of all employees with relevant clearances." They emerged onto level 42 to find it transformed into a crisis command Center. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across workstations where dozens of technicians hunched over displays, their fingers flying across holographic interfaces as they traced the digital footprints of the attack. At the center of the organized chaos, Takashi Han worked with focused intensity, his screen displaying cascading data streams that seemed to dance under his touch. "Mr. Han discovered the breach," explained Marcus Thompson, approaching them with exhaustion etched across his features. His pattern recognition algorithms caught the anomaly before our standard security systems even registered the intrusion. Victoria watched Takashi work, noting the way his colleagues deferred to his expertise. Despite his modest corporate rank, there was something almost hypnotic about his concentration, the methodical way he parsed through layers of corrupted data to identify the underlying attack structure. "The intruder used a fascinating approach," Takashi said without looking up. From his screen, apparently addressing the room at large, instead of overwhelming our defenses, they mimicked normal user behavior patterns. It's almost like they were teaching the system to ignore them. "How long until you can trace the source?" Blackwood demanded. "That's the interesting part," Takashi replied, finally turning to face them. "The attack patterns suggest multiple entry points, but they're all consistent with a single behavioral signature. Whoever did this understands both our technical architecture and our psychological profiling systems." Victoria found herself studying his face in the emergency lighting, noticing the way stress and exhaustion had stripped away some of his careful professional composure. For the first time, she could see glimpses of the person beneath the corporate exterior, intelligent, determined, and carrying a weight of responsibility that seemed too heavy for his modest position. "I need coffee," she announced suddenly. "Mr. Han, would you join me? I'd like to discuss your findings." She saw the surprise flicker across his features, followed by what might have been resignation. Around them, the crisis response continued its relentless pace, but Victoria found herself oddly detached from the urgency. The attack was serious, but it would be resolved. What interested her more was the opportunity to observe Takashi outside, the careful constraints of normal business hours. The executive break room on level 80 was empty at 1:30 a.m., its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Neo-Tokyo's sleepless skyline. Victoria programmed the coffee dispenser for 2 cups, while Takashi stood awkwardly near the entrance, clearly uncertain about the protocol for informal meetings with CEOs during corporate emergencies. "Relax," she said, handing him a steaming cup. "This isn't a performance evaluation." "What is it then?" His directness surprised her, though she was beginning to recognize it as characteristic of their interactions. "Curiosity," Victoria admitted, settling into one of the soft chairs that lined the windows. "You've been working for 5 years too? Understand our systems, and tonight someone used that knowledge against us. That has to be frustrating." Takashi considered this, taking a tentative sip of his coffee before answering. "Frustrating isn't the word I'd use. More like ... inevitable. Any system that reduces human behavior to predictable patterns creates its own vulnerabilities. The more sophisticated the prediction algorithms become, the easier they are to exploit by someone who understands their assumptions." Victoria found herself leaning forward, genuinely engaged. "You sound like you've given this considerable thought." "My sister used to say that the most dangerous systems are the ones that work perfectly," Takashi said quietly. "They make us forget that perfection is an illusion, and illusions can be shattered." The reference to Yuki Han sent a chill through Victoria's chest. She remembered signing the settlement papers, dismissing the death as an unfortunate accident. Now, sitting across from Takashi in the pre-dawn darkness, she wondered what truths had been buried along with his sister. "Tell me about her," Victoria said impulsively. Takashi's expression shuddered immediately, the walls going back up with almost audible finality. "Miss Sterling, I don't think, please, not as your CEO, just as someone who's curious about the people behind the data." Something in her tone must have reached him because, after a long moment, his posture relaxed slightly. Yuki was brilliant. 2 years younger than me, but she understood technology in ways that made the rest of us look like children playing with toys. She believed that artificial intelligence could enhance human potential instead of replacing it. And she worked here? Security Systems Division. She was developing algorithms that could identify genuine threats while protecting individual privacy. The idea was to create surveillance that served people instead of controlling them. Takashi's voice carried the weight of old grief. She died before she could finish the project. Victoria felt the pieces clicking together. Yuki's research into privacy protection. Her sudden death, the corporate investigation that had been resolved with suspicious efficiency. What do you think really happened to her? The question hung between them like a bridge across a chasm. Takashi studied her face for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks of honesty against the possibility that she might actually listen. I think she discovered something that threatened the wrong people, he said finally. And I think the same systems we trust to protect us were used to eliminate the threat she represented. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She'd spent her entire adult life building and defending Nexus Corporation's surveillance empire, believing that knowledge was power and power was protection. But sitting in the darkness with Takashi, she began to see the other side of that equation, the human cost of algorithmic control. The lives compressed into data points and discarded when they became inconvenient. Is that why you refused the Destiny Protocol? She asked quietly. Because you don't trust the system to know what's best for you. I refused because I want to choose my own mistakes, Takashi replied, even if those choices lead to loneliness or failure or any of the other. Things algorithms are designed to prevent. At least they'd be mine. Their eyes met across the small table. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, a crack in the carefully constructed facade that had defined her for 31 years. For the first time in her life, she was sitting across from someone who valued authentic choice over optimized outcomes, who would rather face uncertainty than surrender autonomy. What if the choice led to something good? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Then it would be even more precious, because it was freely made. The silence stretched between them, filled with implications that had nothing to do with corporate hierarchies or algorithmic matches. Victoria found herself thinking about the woman she might have become if she'd been allowed to choose her own path, make her own mistakes, discover her own definition of happiness. We should get back, Takashi said eventually, though he made no move to stand. I'll need the analysis completed before morning. Yes, Victoria agreed, though she found herself reluctant to return to the world of crisis management and corporate responsibility. Here, in the quiet darkness, she felt more like herself than she had in years. As they walked back toward the elevators, Dr. Blackwood emerged from the emergency command center, his expression sharp with triumph and suspicion. Victoria, excellent timing. We've identified the source of the attack. His gaze moved between her and Takashi with calculating intensity. It seems we have more to discuss than just security breaches. The moment of connection shattered like crystal against concrete, and Victoria felt the familiar weight of corporate reality settling back over her shoulders. But something had changed during those stolen minutes in the darkness. For the first time in her carefully orchestrated existence, she'd glimpsed what it might feel like to choose authenticity over algorithm, humanity over optimization. And despite the danger she sensed in Blackwood's knowing smile, she found herself wanting more. The attack began subtly, with the precision of a master surgeon and the ruthlessness of a corporate executioner. On Monday morning, Takashi arrived at his workstation to find his security clearance had been downgraded overnight. The message in his inbox was bureaucratically polite. Routine security review pending completion of internal audit procedures. By Tuesday, his project assignments had been mysteriously reassigned to other analysts. His access to the financial services databases, the very systems where he'd made his breakthrough discoveries, was suddenly restricted. When he questioned his supervisor, Janet Morrison offered apologetic shrugs and vague references to directives from upper management. "They're isolating you," Marcus whispered during their lunch break, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by barely concealed anxiety. He glanced around the level 42 break room, as if expecting surveillance drones to materialize from the ventilation. System. Classic corporate warfare tactics. Death by 1,000 cuts. Takashi stared at his untouched sandwich, his appetite vanishing as the scope of the systematic campaign became clear. "How long have you been documenting this?" "Since Friday night." "The security audit, the clearance downgrades?" the project reassignments. It's all coordinated. Marcus pulled up a hidden partition on his tablet, revealing spreadsheets filled with timestamps and access logs. Someone's orchestrating this from the top level. This isn't random bureaucracy, it's targeted elimination. The data painted a clear picture of corporate assassination. Every restriction, every reassignment, every procedural delay had been timed to create maximum isolation with minimum visibility. Takashi was being erased from Nexus Corporation's systems as methodically as a virus being quarantined and deleted. They're not just removing you from projects, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. They're systematically destroying your credibility. By the time they're finished, it'll look like you were never qualified for this position. In the first place, Takashi felt the walls closing in around him, the same algorithmic precision that had once fascinated him now being weaponized against his career. His reputation, his future. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being destroyed by the very systems he'd helped to build. But this goes deeper than bureaucratic harassment. Someone's been modifying your personnel file. The evidence was damning. Performance reviews that had praised Takashi's analytical skills now contained subtle criticisms of his collaborative abilities and adaptability to organizational change. Psychological evaluations that had previously rated him as stable and reliable suddenly highlighted potential resistance to authority structures and concerning patterns of social isolation. Dr. Blackwood's digital fingerprints are all over this, Marcus continued, his voice barely audible. He's not just trying to discredit you, he's rewriting your entire employment history to justify whatever comes next. What came next arrived on Wednesday morning in the form of a formal HR investigation. Takashi was escorted to a sterile conference room on level 60, where a tribunal of corporate executives reviewed fabricated evidence of data theft, unauthorized system access, and breach of confidentiality agreements. The charges were precisely crafted serious enough to justify termination, but ambiguous enough to avoid criminal prosecution. Mr. Han, said Director Patricia Walsh, her voice carrying the cold efficiency of someone who had destroyed careers for breakfast. These allegations are quite serious. Corporate security has identified several instances where you accessed sensitive financial data outside your authorized scope. Takashi studied the evidence displayed on the conference room's wall screen server logs showing his user credentials, accessing systems he'd never touched, timestamps placing him in secured areas during times when he'd been home asleep, communications allegedly sent from his account that he'd never written. This data has been falsified, he said quietly, his voice steady, despite the rage burning in his chest. That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Han, Director Walsh replied. Are you suggesting that Nexus Corporation's security systems have been compromised? The trap was elegant in its simplicity. If Takashi denied the charges, he appeared to be lying in the face of overwhelming digital evidence. If he claimed the evidence was fabricated, he was accusing the company of conspiracy, a charge that would mark him as paranoid and delusional. I'm suggesting that sophisticated systems can be manipulated by sophisticated people, Takashi said finally. Director Walsh's expression remained neutral. But Takashi caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested his response had been anticipated. Mr. Han, your psychological profile indicates increasing paranoia and resistance to authority. Following your sister's unfortunate accident, perhaps these allegations are symptoms of unresolved grief rather than actual misconduct. The casual reference to Yuki's death hit Takashi like a physical blow. They weren't just destroying his career, they were using his sister's memory as a weapon, twisting his legitimate suspicions into evidence of mental instability. I want to speak with Victoria Sterling, he said. Miss Sterling is occupied with board meetings this week, Director Walsh replied smoothly. However, Dr. Blackwood has expressed interest in helping you work through these challenges. He's developed some innovative therapeutic protocols that might address your adjustment difficulties. The meeting concluded, with Takashi placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's completion. His corporate access was suspended, his company-provided equipment confiscated, his biometric wristband deactivated. In the span of 72 hours, he'd been transformed from a valued employee into a suspected criminal. His 5-year career at Nexus Corporation reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of defying corporate authority. But unknown to the corporate tribunal, their systematic destruction of Takashi Han is being documented in real time by someone with both the technical skills and moral conviction to expose their methods. Sarah Mitchell had been investigating Nexus Corporation for 8 months, following a trail of privacy violations and corporate overreach that it led her deep into the company's surveillance apparatus. The freelance journalist had cultivated sources throughout the corporation, disaffected employees, former executives, and technical staff who'd grown uncomfortable with the ethical implications of their work. Marcus Thompson had contacted her 3 days after Takashi's Destiny Protocol refusal, providing encrypted files that documented the systematic harassment campaign. Now, as she reviewed the evidence from her encrypted workspace in a Neo-Tokyo coffee shop, Sarah recognized the pattern she'd been tracking across multiple corporations: the methodical destruction of individuals who posed threats to algorithmic control systems. "The beautiful thing about digital evidence," she muttered to herself as she compiled the documentation, "is that it creates its own trail." Dr. Blackwood had been thorough in fabricating Takashi's misconduct, but he'd also been careless. Every falsified log entry, every modified personnel file, every manipulated timestamp existed alongside legitimate system records that revealed the manipulation. Sarah's forensic analysis software, designed specifically for exposing corporate malfeasance, highlighted the discrepancies like neon signs against a dark sky. More damaging than the individual fabrications was the pattern they revealed. Takashi wasn't Blackwood's first target. Sarah's investigation had uncovered similar campaigns against 17 other employees over the past 3 years. All had been individuals who'd questioned corporate policies, resisted algorithmic control systems, or attempted to expose privacy violations. All had been systematically destroyed using identical methods, and all had connections to research projects that threatened the surveillance architecture that Blackwood had spent his career building, including Yuki Han, Sarah whispered as she opened the file that had taken her months to compile. The official investigation into Yuki's death had been a masterpiece of corporate cover-up, but patient detective work had revealed the truth buried beneath layers of bureaucratic misdirection. Yuki Han hadn't died in an industrial accident. She'd been murder-eliminated because her privacy protection algorithms posed an existential threat to Nexus Corporation's surveillance empire. Method had been subtle, untraceable, and perfectly designed to look like an allergic reaction rather than assassination. Sarah's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Marcus. "They've escalated. Talk's been suspended. Board meeting tomorrow to decide his fate." She stared at the message, feeling the weight of responsibility settling over her shoulders.
Takashi.
Han was about to become the 18th victim of Blackwood's systematic campaign, lest someone with the power to expose the truth chose to act. But exposure required more than evidence. It required someone on the inside with the courage to stand against the system that had created them. Someone like Victoria Sterling, who'd spent weeks displaying an unusual interest in the man who'd rejected her algorithmic match. Hira began typing, crafting the message that would either save Takashi Han or destroy them all. In corporate warfare, timing was everything. Tomorrow's board meeting would determine whether humanity or algorithm would triumph in the battle for Nexus Corporation's soul. Outside her window, Neo-Tokyo pulsed with its eternal rhythm of commerce and surveillance. Millions of lives reduced to data points in the vast algorithmic machinery that Blackwood had built. But somewhere in that digital maze, cracks were forming hairline. Fractures that suggested even the most sophisticated systems were vulnerable to the chaos of authentic human choice. The question was whether those cracks would widen into revolution or be sealed forever by the corporate forces marshalling against them. The emergency board meeting convened at 9 a.m. sharp in the glass-walled conference room that occupied the pinnacle of Nexus Corporation's tower. Victoria sat at the head of the polished obsidian table, surrounded by 12 board members whose combined wealth could purchase small nations. While holographic displays showed real-time corporate metrics that pulsed like the vital signs of a living organism, Dr. Blackwood stood at the presentation console, his silver hair catching the morning light as he methodically dismantled Takashi Han's reputation with the precision of a master surgeon. Charts and graphs painted the portrait of a dangerous employee, psychologically unstable, potentially compromised, and representing an existential threat to corporate security. "The evidence is overwhelming," Blackwood declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to reshaping reality through careful manipulation of data. "Mr. Han has demonstrated a pattern of insubordination, unauthorized system access, and psychological instability that poses significant risk to our operations." Victoria watched the presentation with growing unease, recognizing the elegant construction of corporate character assassination. Every piece of evidence was plausible, every conclusion logical, every recommendation reasonable. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic destruction, designed to eliminate a threat while maintaining the veneer of due process. But she'd spent enough time with Takashi to recognize the fundamental flaw in Blackwood's narrative. It described someone she'd never met, a paranoid corporate saboteur who bore no resemblance to the thoughtful, principled man who'd shared coffee with her in the pre-dawn darkness. Dr. Blackwood interrupted board member Harrison Webb, his gravelly voice cutting through the presentation. "These allegations are serious, but the evidence seems circumstantial. Do we have any direct proof of malicious intent?" Blackwood's smile was coldly triumphant. "Actually, we do. Security analysis has revealed that Mr. Han was the likely source of last week's cyber attack. His behavioral patterns matched the intrusion methodology. His access privileges would have allowed him to execute the breach." Victoria's blood ran cold. She remembered the attack, surgical precision of the intrusion, the message left behind. Some patterns can't be predicted. But she also remembered watching Takashi work through the night to trace the attack's source. His genuine expertise in identifying the threat. "That's impossible," she said quietly. The room fell silent. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward her, registering surprise at her interruption. Blackwood's expression shifted from triumph to wariness, his pale eyes searching her face for signs of the challenge he'd apparently been expecting. "Victoria." Board Chairman Kenneth Sterling, her father, leaned forward with the particular concern he reserved for moments when his daughter deviated from corporate script. "Do you have additional information about this situation?" Victoria felt the weight of 31 years of corporate conditioning pressing down on her shoulders. Every instinct trained into her since childhood demanded compliance with Blackwood's recommendation. The evidence was compelling, the threat assessment logical, the proposed solution efficient. In the algorithmic world that had shaped her entire existence, eliminating Takashi Han was the optimal choice. But sitting in that pristine conference room, surrounded by the architectural symbols of corporate power, Victoria found herself thinking about authentic choice versus optimized outcomes. About the difference between being protected and being imprisoned. About a man who'd chosen to value truth over security, even when that choice led to persecution. "I have concerns about the investigation's methodology," she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. Blackwood's expression hardened. "Victoria, I understand that you've taken a personal interest in this employee, but we cannot allow sentiment to compromise corporate security." The casual dismissal of her concerns as sentiment sparked something dangerous in Victoria's chest. Around the table, board members exchanged glances that suggested this confrontation had been anticipated, perhaps even orchestrated. "My concerns aren't sentimental, Richard. They're procedural." The counterweights of Victoria stood, moving to the presentation console with the fluid grace that had been drilled into her through years of executive training. "May I?" Without waiting for permission, she accessed her personal files, displaying the fraud analysis report that Takashi had prepared. The work that had first captured her attention with its insights about algorithmic limitations and human complexity. This report demonstrates Mr. Han's expertise in identifying system vulnerabilities and understanding behavioral patterns, she said, watching as board members leaned forward to study the data. "If he wanted to attack our systems, why would he simultaneously document the very methods that would expose such an attack?" "Perhaps to create plausible deniability," Blackwood suggested, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "Or perhaps because he's genuinely committed to improving our security rather than undermining it." Victoria pulled up additional file surveillance footage of Takashi working through the cyber attack, biometric data showing his stress response patterns during the crisis. communication logs demonstrating his collaboration with the security team. The evidence suggests that Mr. Han was instrumental in containing the attack, not orchestrating it. His behavioral patterns during the crisis are consistent with someone genuinely committed to protecting corporate assets. Board member Margaret Chen raised her hand. Ms. Sterling, are you suggesting that Dr. Blackwood's investigation has been compromised? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Victoria felt the eyes of the board upon her, recognizing that her next words would determine not just Takashi's fate, but her own position within the corporate hierarchy she'd spent her life climbing in the silence. Her tablet chimed with an encrypted message from an unknown sender. She glanced at it briefly, then felt her blood freeze as she read the preview. Evidence of systematic employee persecution, including Yuki Han murder. Full documentation attached. Mitchell, investigative journalist. The smoking gun. The message included a single attachment to forensic analysis that laid bare Blackwood's campaign against corporate dissidents, complete with fabricated evidence, manipulated personnel files, and a pattern of elimination that stretched back 3 years. But most damning was the documentation of Yuki Han's assassination, revealing that Takashi's sister had been murdered for threatening the surveillance architecture that defined Nexus Corporation's power. Victoria's hands slightly as she absorbed the implications. Every instinct screamed at her to delete the message, to protect the corporate structure that had given her life meaning and purpose. But looking across the table at Blackwood's expectant face, she realized that she was facing the same choice. That had confronted Takashi: algorithm or authenticity, optimization or truth. Actually, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, I'm suggesting that this entire investigation is a fabrication designed to eliminate someone who poses a threat to our surveillance systems. The room erupted in controlled corporate chaos, board members demanding explanations, Blackwood protesting his innocence, her father's voice cutting through the noise with sharp commands for order. But Victoria ignored them all, transferring Sarah Mitchell's evidence to the main presentation display. For 3 years, Dr. Blackwood has been systematically destroying employees who question our privacy practices or resist algorithmic control systems, she announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. 17 individuals have been targeted using identical methods: fabricated evidence, manipulated personnel files, orchestrated character assassination. The unraveling the forensic data painted an undeniable picture of corporate corruption. Blackwood's face had gone ashen, his carefully constructed authority crumbling as board members studied the evidence of his systematic persecution campaign. This is preposterous, he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Victoria, you're making a serious mistake. These documents could be fabricated by the same individual who murdered Yuki Han. Victoria's voice cut through his protestations like a blade. Evidence shows that she was assassinated because her privacy protection algorithms threatened your surveillance architecture. Her death wasn't an industrial accident, it was corporate murder. The silence that followed was deafening. Board members stared at the evidence displayed on the room's multiple screens, their faces reflecting the horror of recognizing the monster they'd unknowingly sheltered. Chairman Sterling's expression had gone ashen, the weight of corporate liability settling over him like a shroud. Dr. Blackwood, he said quietly, you're suspended pending a full investigation. Security will escort you from the building immediately. The mask falls, but Blackwood wasn't finished. His pale eyes fixed on Victoria with naked hatred, his composure finally cracking to reveal the authoritarian zealot beneath the corporate facade. You have no idea what you've done, he hissed. The systems I built protect this company, this city, this entire civilization from the chaos of unmanaged human choice. Without algorithmic guidance, people make decisions that destroy themselves and everyone around them, save them from their own stupidity. You enslaved them, Victoria replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. You turned human beings into data points and murdered anyone who threatened your control. I optimized them. Blackwood's voice rose to a shout, his intellectual arrogance finally revealing its true face. I eliminated the inefficiencies of emotion, the irrationalities of personal choice, the catastrophic mistakes that come from trusting human judgment over algorithmic precision.
Actress.
The confession hung in the air like an indictment around the table. Board members exchanged glances that suggested the full scope of their liability was becoming clear. Nexus Corporation hadn't just enabled a surveillance state, they'd protected a sociopathic genius who viewed murder as acceptable optimization. Reckoning as security escorted Blackwood from the room, Victoria felt something fundamental shifting inside her chest. For 31 years, she'd believed that corporate power and algorithmic control were forces for good, protecting people from their own poor choices while maximizing efficiency and productivity. Now, watching the man who'd embodied those principles being dragged away in disgrace, she understood the true cost of optimization without humanity. The price of perfection measured in human lives. The horror of a world where choice itself had become the enemy. The boardroom fell silent, except for the soft hum of climate control and the distant sound of Blackwood's protests echoing down the corridor. Victoria remained standing at the presentation console, her hand still resting on the tablet that had delivered the truth she'd never wanted to see. Her father cleared his throat. "Victoria, we need to discuss immediate containment strategies. The liability exposure alone could know," said quietly, turning to face the table full of corporate executives. "We need to discuss justice. We need to find Takashi Han before Blackwood's people do." For the first time in her life, Victoria Sterling had chosen truth over efficiency, humanity over optimization. The algorithm that had governed her existence for 3 decades lay in ruins around her feet, and she discovered that she felt more alive than she had in years. But watching Blackwood's final breakdown, she realized that the same systems she'd trusted to optimize human behavior had been used to eliminate anyone who refused to be optimized. "The Takashi Han investigation is officially closed," she announced to the remaining board members. "All charges are dropped, his access restored, his personnel file cleared of any reference to this fabricated evidence." But even as she spoke the words, Victoria knew that clearing Takashi's record was only the beginning. Blackwood's surveillance architecture still existed. The Destiny Protocol still matched employees according to algorithmic logic, and thousands of Nexus Corporation workers still lived under the constant scrutiny of systems designed to control rather than serve them. The choice she'd made in that boardroom to choose humanity over algorithm, truth over optimization, was just the first step in a much larger transformation. And somewhere in Neo-Tokyo, a data analyst who'd refused to be matched was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous choice is also the most necessary one. For the first time in her life, Victoria Sterling had chosen authenticity over authority. The consequences would follow, but they would be genuinely hers to face. Victoria found Takashi in the small park across from Nexus Corporation's tower, sitting on a bench beneath cherry blossoms that had somehow survived the urban development surrounding them. He looked smaller outside the corporate environment, more human without the sterile backdrop of office lighting and surveillance cameras. When he saw her approaching, his expression shifted from surprise to wariness, the look of someone who'd learned not to trust unexpected encounters with corporate executives. "Ms. Sterling." He started to stand, but she gestured for him to remain seated. "Please, just Victoria. I think we're past corporate formalities." She settled beside him on the bench, acutely aware that this was the first time in years she'd sat somewhere without knowing exactly who was monitoring her conversations. "I wanted to apologize, not to ask for your help." Takashi studied her face with a careful attention. She'd come to recognize as characteristic of his approach to everything measured. Thoughtful, searching for patterns beneath surface appearances. Help with what? Dismantling the surveillance state we built. The words came out more bluntly than she'd intended, but Victoria found herself oddly relieved by their directness. Blackwood's been removed, but his systems are still active. The Destiny Protocol, the biometric monitoring, the behavioral analysis algorithms, they're all still operating, still controlling people's lives. And you want to shut them down? I want to transform them. Turn surveillance systems into privacy protection tools, convert control mechanisms into choice enhancement platforms. Victoria pulled out her tablet, showing him preliminary designs that Alina had helped her develop. but I need someone who understands both the technical architecture and the human cost. Takashi was quiet for a long moment, watching the cherry blossoms drift across the path like digital snow. Why me? You have hundreds of engineers, entire departments of specialists. Because you're the only person who refused to be optimized? Victoria's voice carried a weight of revelation that surprised them both. Everyone else in the company, myself included, has been shaped by these systems for so long that we can't imagine alternatives. You never surrendered your ability to choose. Before Takashi could respond, Marcus Thompson emerged from behind a nearby tree, his tablet clutched against his chest, and his expression mixing excitement with apprehension. Sorry to interrupt, but Sarah Mitchell is here. And she says we need to move fast. The investigative journalist approached with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to working against tight deadlines and powerful opposition. She was smaller than Victoria had expected, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their surroundings for potential threats or escape routes. "Miss Sterling," Sarah said, without preamble, "what you did in that boardroom was either very brave or very stupid, possibly both. I exposed a murderer and stopped a systematic persecution campaign. You also made yourself a target." Sarah activated a signal jamming device that would prevent their conversation from being monitored by Nexus Corporation's ambient surveillance systems. Blackwood may be gone, but his supporters in the corporate hierarchy aren't. They're already planning damage control, limited liability, selective prosecution, minimal systemic change. Elena Rodriguez appeared at Victoria's shoulder, having followed her from the tower with the protective instincts that had made her invaluable as both assistant and confidant. The board is meeting again this afternoon. They're discussing measured reforms and gradual implementation of enhanced privacy protocols. Translation: they want to make cosmetic changes while preserving the fundamental surveillance architecture, Marcus said grimly. Victoria felt the familiar weight of corporate politics settling over the conversation, the intricate dance of power and liability that had shaped her entire career. But for the first time, she found herself viewing these maneuvers from the outside, seeing them as obstacles to overcome rather than rules to follow. "What do you need from me?" she asked Sarah. "Complete access to Nexus Corporation's surveillance systems, source code, implementation protocols, data collection methodologies, everything." Sarah's request was audacious in its scope. "I can't expose the full extent of corporate surveillance with partial information. That level of access would be corporate suicide," Elena pointed out diplomatically. "The board would remove Victoria immediately, and any evidence obtained would be legally compromised." "Which is why we don't ask for permission," Takashi said quietly. All eyes turned to him as he continued. "I still have my security clearances, and Marcus has administrative access to most of the core systems." Marcus nodded slowly. "We could document everything: the privacy violations, behavioral manipulation protocols, the psychological conditioning algorithms, create a complete record before they have time to sanitize the evidence." "You'd be destroying your careers," Victoria warned. "Once this information goes public, Nexus Corporation will come after you with everything they have." "They already tried to destroy my career," Takashi replied. "The difference is that now I'm choosing the fight instead of having it forced on me." Sarah leaned forward, her journalist's instincts recognizing the moment when sources committed to full disclosure. "How long would you need?" 72 hours, Marcus estimated. "Maybe less if we coordinate properly. But we'd need someone on the inside to prevent early detection." Victoria found herself thinking about Elena's psychology training, her understanding of human motivation and corporate dynamics. "Lena, you understand these systems better than anyone. Should you help coordinate without triggering security protocols?" Her assistant's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, concern, and something that might have been excitement. "I've been watching you change over the past few weeks, watching you discover that there might be more to life than corporate optimization. Yes, I can help." The conspiracy took shape with surprising speed, their different expertise areas complementing each other in ways that felt almost algorithmic, though. Victoria recognized the irony in that comparison. Sarah would handle external communications and legal protection. Marcus would manage technical access and data extraction. Elena would coordinate internal movements and provide psychological insights. and Takashi would serve as the moral compass, ensuring that their rebellion served human dignity rather than personal revenge. "There's something else," Sarah said as they prepared to separate. "Other corporations are watching this situation closely. If we can prove that employee surveillance and algorithmic control are both ineffective and illegal, it could trigger investigations across the entire tech industry." Victoria felt a flutter of something that might have been fear or excitement. "You're talking about systemic change." "I'm talking about giving people back their right to choose their own mistakes," Sarah replied, echoing Takashi's words from their midnight conversation. "The question is whether you're ready to be remembered as the CEO who dismantled her own empire to protect human autonomy." Looking around at the small group of allies, the data analyst who'd refused optimization, the engineer who'd documented corporate corruption, the journalist who'd exposed systematic persecution, and the assistant who'd watched her boss discover her own humanity, Victoria realized that she'd found something more valuable than corporate power or algorithmic control. She'd found people worth fighting alongside. 72 hours, she said, standing and brushing cherry blossom petals from her executive suit. "Then we show the world what authentic choice looks like," as they dispersed back toward the tower. Victoria felt the weight of decisions settling over her shoulders. But for the first time in her carefully orchestrated existence, that weight felt like freedom rather than responsibility. She was about to destroy everything she'd spent her life building, and she'd never felt more certain that she was making the right choice. The story broke at exactly 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. When the first wave of Sarah Mitchell's expose flooded news networks across 3 continents, Victoria watched the initial reports from her executive suite, surrounded by wall-mounted displays that had suddenly become windows into her company's destruction rather than tools of corporate control. Nexus Corporation, Surveillance Empire Exposed, scrolled across international headlines, while leaked documents painted a picture of systematic privacy violations that stretched back a decade. But it was the personal stories that cut deepest employees, describing years of algorithmic manipulation, romantic relationships orchestrated by corporate matchmaking systems, and the systematic elimination of anyone who dared to resist. "Ma'am," Elena's voice carried unusual tension as she entered the office. "The board is demanding an emergency meeting. Security is reporting multiple breach attempts, and our stock price has dropped 30% in the first hour of trading." Victoria nodded, her attention focused on the cascade of revelations streaming across her screens. Marcus and Takashi had been thorough in their documentation. Every privacy violation, every instance of behavioral manipulation, every case of corporate retaliation was laid bare with forensic precision. "There's more," Elena continued. "The Regulatory Commission has announced an immediate investigation, and 17 other tech companies are facing similar scrutiny. This isn't just about Nexus Corporation anymore." The magnitude of what they'd unleashed was staggering. Victoria had expected corporate damage, legal consequences, possibly criminal charges. But watching the global response unfold, she realized they'd triggered something far larger, fundamental. Reckoning with the surveillance economy that had shaped the past decade of technological development, her personal communication system chimed with an encrypted message from Sarah Mitchell. "Phase 2 launching now. Prepare for escalation." Before Victoria could respond, alarms began echoing through the building's emergency systems. Her displays flickered, then went dark, replaced by a single message that appeared simultaneously on every screen throughout Nexus Corporation: "Truth cannot be contained." Marcus's voice crackled through the building's communication system, reaching every employee simultaneously. "Attention Nexus Corporation staff. For the past 72 hours, we have been documenting the systematic violations of your privacy, autonomy, and human dignity. What you're about to see is the truth about the systems that have controlled your lives." The revelation began with the Destiny Protocol detailed analysis of how the romantic matchmaking system had manipulated employees. Personal relationships for corporate benefit. Biometric data showed the stress responses of workers forced into algorithmic partnerships, while leaked communications revealed board discussions about using romantic control to increase productivity and reduce employee turnover. Manipulation went deeper than romantic pairings. The documents revealed behavioral conditioning protocols designed to shape employee personalities, surveillance systems that monitored private conversations and personal relationships, and algorithmic assessments that determined everything from promotion opportunities to healthcare benefits based on compliance with corporate preferences. Your thoughts, your feelings, your most intimate choices, all of them, have been monitored, analyzed, and manipulated by systems designed to optimize you for corporate benefit. Marcus's voice continued, his technical expertise lending credibility to revelations that might otherwise seem too dystopian to believe. Victoria watched her employees' faces on the building's security cameras as they absorbed the truth about their digital imprisonment. Some reacted with anger, others with resignation, but most displayed the particular numbness that came with recognizing that their entire adult lives had been shaped by forces they'd never understood. The revelation's climax came with Yuki Han's murder forensic evidence showing how a brilliant researcher had been eliminated for threatening the surveillance architecture. The documentation was comprehensive: the fabricated allergen exposure, the corrupted investigation, the systematic cover-up that had buried the truth for 3 years. My sister died because she believed that technology should serve humanity rather than control it. Takashi's voice joined Marcus's broadcast, carrying a weight of grief and determination that silenced the building's ambient noise. She was murdered by the same systems we've trusted to protect us. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Employees throughout the building began removing their biometric wristbands, the physical symbols of corporate surveillance that had become as unconscious as breathing. Security cameras captured scenes of workers destroying monitoring equipment, while others simply walked out of the building, choosing unemployment over continued complicity. But corporate security wasn't passive. Within minutes of the broadcast beginning, armed guards moved through the building with systematic efficiency, attempting to contain the revelation by force. They found Marcus first, arresting him in the survey room where he'd been coordinating the data release. Let him go. Victoria's voice echoed through the building's communication system as she activated her executive override codes. This is Victoria Sterling, and I am ordering you to stand down. The corporate security team hesitated, caught between conflicting authorities and uncertain about the legal implications of following orders from a CEO who had apparently authorized the exposure of her own company. Alina appeared at Victoria's side, her expression mixing admiration with concern.
Altamati Security
is reporting that the board has voted to remove you from your position. They're claiming you've had a psychological breakdown. Victoria almost laughed at the irony. According to corporate logic, choosing humanity over algorithm was indeed a form of breakdown, a failure of the optimization systems that had shaped her entire existence. Good, she said simply. Then I'm finally free to make authentic choices. The building's emergency systems activated as the full scope of the crisis became clear. Regulatory investigators were already en route. Media crews surrounded the tower, and protesters began gathering in the streets below. International law enforcement agencies were coordinating responses to what was being called the largest corporate surveillance scandal in history. Sarah Mitchell's final revelation came through external news networks rather than internal communications. The investigative journalist had uncovered evidence that Nexus Corporation's surveillance methods had been sold to 17 other companies, creating a vast network of employee monitoring that affected millions of workers across multiple industries. This isn't just about one company, Sarah's voice carried across news broadcasts worldwide. This is about an entire economic system that treats human autonomy as a problem to be solved rather than a right to be protected. Victoria stood at her office windows, watching as the city below absorbed the truth about digital surveillance and corporate control. Nexus Corporation's tower had become the symbol of systematic dehumanization, but it was also becoming something else, the place where people had chosen to fight back. Alina handed her a tablet showing resignation letters from half the company's employees, while Marcus's arrest had triggered solidarity protests throughout the building. But there was also something else in the data applications from engineers and analysts who wanted to help transform the surveillance systems into privacy protection tools. It's not over, Victoria said quietly, watching protesters gather in the streets below. This is just the beginning. The old world of algorithmic control was crumbling around them, but something new was being born from its ruins, a future where technology served human dignity rather than corporate profit, where authentic choice mattered more than optimized outcomes. And for the first time in her life, Victoria Sterling was excited to discover what that future might hold. 6 months after the revelation that brought down Nexus Corporation's surveillance empire, Victoria Sterling sat in a small cafe in the Shibuya district, watching the morning crowd flow past windows that bore no corporate logos or biometric scanners. The world had changed in ways both subtle and profound. People move differently now, with less hurried efficiency and more genuine interaction, as if remembering how to exist without constant algorithmic oversight. The regulatory framework is finally taking shape, Sarah Mitchell said, settling into the chair across from Victoria with 2 steaming cups of coffee. The investigative journalist looked younger somehow, the weight of corporate secrets no longer pressing down on her shoulders. The Digital Rights Protection Act passed in 17 countries last week. No more employee biometric monitoring without explicit consent. No more algorithmic matching for personal relationships, and complete transparency in behavioral analysis systems. Victoria nodded, absently touching the spot on her wrist where her corporate monitoring device had once resided. The tan line had finally faded, but the psychological adjustment had taken longer. Learning to make decisions without algorithmic guidance had been terrifying. At first, every choice feeling weighted with potential catastrophe. But gradually, she discovered that authentic mistakes were indeed more precious than optimized successes. "How's Marcus adjusting to his new role?" Sarah asked. "He loves it. Running the Digital Privacy Institute gives him a chance to use his technical skills for protection rather than surveillance." Victoria smiled, remembering her former employee's excitement about developing encryption tools for individual users, rather than corporate monitoring systems, though he still won't admit that getting arrested made him famous in privacy advocacy circles. Through the cafe windows, Victoria could see the skeleton of what had once been Nexus Corporation's tower. The building was being transformed into a community center, the surveillance architecture replaced with makerspaces, community gardens, and collaborative workspaces where people could create without being monitored or optimized. And Takashi. Sarah's question carried the particular tone that suggested she'd noticed something beyond professional collaboration in Victoria's voice. Victoria felt warmth spreading through her chest at the mention of his name. He's teaching at Tokyo University now. Computer ethics and human-centered design. His students are developing applications that enhance human choice rather than replacing it. That's not what I meant. The direct challenge made Victoria laugh, a genuine sound that would have been algorithmically analyzed and categorized just months before. We're figuring it out. Learning to build something real without systems telling us whether we're compatible. It had been the strangest courtship imaginable. 2 people who'd met through corporate manipulation, trying to discover whether their connection could survive in the absence of algorithmic pressure. Their first actual date had been awkward. Both of them hyper-aware that no system was monitoring their biometric responses or analyzing their conversation. Patterns for compatibility indicators. But slowly, tentatively, they'd begun to trust the uncertain process of authentic human connection. Victoria had learned that Takashi's quiet intensity masked a playful sense of humor, while he'd discovered that her corporate confidence could coexist with genuine vulnerability. They moved at the pace of choice rather than optimization, sometimes succeeding, always learning. "He's picking me up in 20 minutes, Victoria admitted. "We're visiting Yuki's memorial garden." The memorial had been one of the first projects funded by the Nexus Corporation's settlement, a quiet space in the heart of Neo-Tokyo where technology served contemplation rather than surveillance. Solar panels powered gentle lighting, while interactive displays allowed visitors to learn about digital privacy rights and the human cost of algorithmic control. Sarah's expression softened. The wrongful death settlement finally went through yesterday. The family declined monetary compensation. They wanted acknowledgement and systemic change instead. Victoria's voice carried a weight of gratitude and responsibility. "Yuki's parents asked me to speak at the memorial service next month. about the importance of choosing humanity over efficiency. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Victoria Sterling, former CEO of a surveillance empire, had become an unlikely advocate for human autonomy and digital rights. She spoke at conferences about the dangers of algorithmic control, consulted with governments on privacy legislation, and helped former corporate executives understand the human cost of optimization-focused business models. Do you miss it? Sarah asked. The corporate power, the algorithmic certainty, the sense of controlling complex systems? Victoria considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, her life had been defined by predictable routines, optimized decisions, and the comforting illusion of perfect information. Now she lived with uncertainty, made choices based on incomplete data, and accepted that failure was an essential component of authentic existence. I miss the simplicity, she said finally, but I don't miss the emptiness. Corporate power is like algorithmic matching. It feels efficient until you realize it's prevented you from discovering who you actually are. The cafe windows. His academic messenger bag slung across his shoulder, and his expression carrying the particular concentration that meant he was working through a complex problem. When he saw Victoria through the glass, his face transformed with the kind of unguarded smile that no algorithm could have predicted or optimized. That's my cue, Victoria said, standing and gathering her things. Victoria? Sarah's voice stopped. Her at the door? For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. All of them. Walking through Neo-Tokyo's streets with Takashi, Victoria marveled at the city's transformation. Digital billboards still painted the skyline in rotating colors, but their messages had changed community announcements rather than corporate propaganda. Local art projects instead of behavioral manipulation, information that served citizens rather than controlling them. The university approved my proposal for next semester, Takashi said as they walked toward the Memorial Garden. A course on ethical technology design with a focus on enhancing human agency rather than replacing it. Students are signing up. Waiting list of over 300. Apparently, there's significant interest in learning how to build systems that serve people rather than optimizing them. They reached the Memorial Garden as the afternoon sun filtered through cherry blossoms that had been planted in Yuki's honor. The space hummed with quiet activity students reading beneath solar-powered shade structures, families teaching children about digital privacy rights, former corporate employees volunteering to maintain the community technology resources. Victoria found herself thinking about algorithms and authenticity, about the difference between being matched and choosing to connect, about the courage required to embrace uncertainty over optimization. Her life had become messier, less predictable, more difficult to quantify. It had also become more genuinely hers than it had ever been. Ready? Takashi asked, offering his hand as they approached Yuki's memorial stone. Victoria took his hand, feeling the warmth of authentic human connection, perfect, uncertain, and entirely chosen. Ready. Together, they walked into a future that no algorithm could predict. The most important choices were made by hearts rather than systems, and where the beautiful chaos of human authenticity had finally triumphed over the sterile perfection of corporate control. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.